Hi there, this is a psychology revision session on experiments and experimental designs. So according to the OCR A-level psychology specification, this is what you need to know in relation to experiments and experimental designs. You're also going to need to be able to evaluate each experimental type and each experimental design. So these are some key concepts that are related to experiments and experimental designs. I'm not going to go through these here and now. However, if you're unsure on any of them, then please take a look on the Quizlet, which is quizlet.com/Mr_Bodin. So these are some of the core studies that use experiments within their research. I've tried to put it as well where possible which experimental design has been used within each study, just to give you some sort of idea as to what it looks like in practice as well. And all of these have been taken from the downloadable Guide to Core Studies 1 and 2 from the OCR website. Okay, so what is an experiment? To put it simply, an experiment is essentially an investigation where one variable is manipulated to measure the effects that it has on another variable. Now, the variable that we manipulate is called the independent variable. The variable that we measure is called the dependent variable. The dependent variable is named as such because it is dependent on a change in the independent variable. So, within a true experiment, the variations in the independent variable are deliberately created by the researcher. So the researcher actively manipulates that variable, and this would be considered a true experiment. Whereas in a quasi-experiment, these variations in the independent variable arise naturally. So for example, if you were researching into schizophrenia, then you would not be able to manipulate the variable to create schizophrenia in an individual. Apart from the practical difficulties that you'd face within doing that, it is also highly unethical to deliberately inflict schizophrenia on an individual. Therefore, this is a quasi-experiment, and there are some good examples within the core studies of quasi-experiments just to get you thinking about what they actually are. One off the top of my head is the Maguire study, looking at the differences in volume in the brain with taxi drivers and non-taxi drivers. We can also have within an experiment different levels or conditions of the independent variable. Now, the reason that you've got levels or conditions is because you may see them referred to either one of these when they crop up within studies. Now, what we mean by different levels or conditions of the independent variable is that there are variations within what is being manipulated. And a great example of this is the research by Loftus and Palmer into leading questions, where the independent variable was the verb used within a leading question to see the DV, which was participants' estimates of speed, and the different levels or conditions with the different verbs that were used within the leading question. Now, there were 5 different levels of the independent variable within Loftus and Palmer's research, and these were the verbs that ranged from, say, like smashed, contacted, hit, just to give you 3 examples. Okay, so clearly you should be able to see that the independent variable is what is manipulated, what is changed, so the verb was what was changed, and the dependent variable being what is measured, so what was being measured was the estimate of speed that participants gave. So for example, if they were asked what speed do you think the cars were going when they smashed into each other, and then the participants would estimate a speed based on that, so they may say 60 miles per hour, just as an out there example. So the three most common experimental designs used within psychological research are an independent measures design, a repeated measures design, and matched participants design, which is sometimes referred to as matched pairs. Now, the use of each design is all to do with allocation to the levels of the IV. So you'll see how it differs between independent, repeated, and matched participants as we go forward. So an independent measures design. Now this consists of using different participants in each condition of the experiment. So using Loftus and Palmer again as an example, an independent measures design would be using one group of participants in, say, the hit condition and a different set of participants within, say, the smashed condition. So completely different participants in each condition or level of the IV, and this makes an independent measures design. Now, as mentioned at the beginning of this session, in relation to the OCR specification, you're also going to need to be able to evaluate each experimental design. Now, in the disadvantages column for independent measures, when we're talking about differences between participants within the groups and how they may affect the results, these are sometimes referred to as individual differences. So this is an element of the participant themselves, so be it their age, their sex, their social background, and how this may then influence the research and therefore affect the results. So by using independent measures and having different participants in each condition, you could find that one condition performs better than another, and it could be down to these individual differences. So repeated measures design. So this is using the same participants in each condition of the independent variable. Due to the fact that in a repeated measures design we have the possibility of order effect, we can use a method called counterbalancing in order to combat order effects. And this image gives a good example of how this could be done. So it's splitting the participants and putting them through the different conditions in a different order. And the final experimental design that could be used within psychological research is matched participants, or as I said earlier, sometimes referred to as matched pairs. So the idea with this experimental design is that you deliberately try to avoid these participant variables or individual differences because you try to match participants up as closely as possible based on their various characteristics. So for example, you might attempt to combat participant variables by pairing up two individuals of the same age, and then what you'd do is you'd split them up and put one into the experimental condition and one into the control condition. And a good example of a core study that uses matched participants within the research is again the Maguire research into the differences in brain volume between taxi drivers and non-taxi drivers. Now, these within that study, participants were matched upon, I think it was age, and also, for example, to go to a level of extreme, which hand they favoured in terms of, if you think of writing, and if they were right-handed or left-handed. Now, thinking ahead, depending on when you are watching this revision video, you may have already covered non-parametric tests within psychology, within the OCR specification, or you may not have done it yet. But just to make you aware that the experimental design that is used within research is one of the criteria that affects which non-parametric tests you can use. So here you've got the 5 main non-parametric inferential tests that are listed within the OCR specification and the experimental design that is applicable to that test. So as you can see, you've got independent measures cropping up twice, repeated measures twice, and then you've got correlation, which is something separate, with Spearman's rho. So if in the exam you get asked a question that goes something along the lines of the researcher has chosen to use Spearman's rho test within their research, why is this important? Why is this the case? Then you know that it has been a correlational design that is used, because correlational design is what's required for Spearman's rho. Spearman's rho is reliant upon correlational design. Now, due to the fact that you can see that independent measures has cropped up twice and repeated measures has cropped up twice, there's also the fact of that you need to know the level of data that was collected within the research, because this will then also influence as criteria. So with Mann-Whitney U, it's a specific level. With Wilcoxon signed ranks, it's a specific level. Same with chi-square and binomial sign. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that experimental design, whilst it is a criteria that needs to be taken into account in choosing a non-parametric test, you also need to know the level of data to be able to differentiate between the non-parametric tests. I'm deliberately not mentioning which levels of data are needed for each each non-parametric test here, because if you've already completed this, then it's a chance for you to do a little bit of revision. If you haven't already completed this, then it might be a chance for you to go out and stretch yourself a little bit. So moving on to the types of experiment that are used within psychological research. So the first one, which we've already talked about, is a quasi-experiment. So as we've already said, within a quasi-experiment, the variations in the independent variable arise naturally. And this leads into some advantages and disadvantages, as with any type of experiment, any type of experimental design. But because these variations arise naturally, it's one of the big advantages of it is the fact that it's highly ethical to use. As mentioned earlier, if you were researching into schizophrenia, you could not deliberately inflict schizophrenia on an individual for the sake of your experiment. So as mentioned at the bottom there, this type of experiment is quite common in psychology due to this fact that it's ethically and practically the only design that can be used. Moving on to another type of experiment. Now, this is referred to as a laboratory experiment, and this doesn't mean that it always takes place within what we would consider to be a laboratory. All that it means is that the experiment is carried out within a well-controlled environment. And one of the other key factors of a laboratory experiment is the idea of the use of a standardized procedure. So the procedure that is used within the experiment is used on all participants, usually within the same order, and this feeds into the idea of the level of control within a laboratory experiment. So as you can see from the advantages, this high level of control means that a cause and effect relationship can be established, meaning that the independent variable does cause the change in the dependent variable, because we're excluding extraneous variables as much as possible. So field experiments, the third and final type of experiment used within psychological research. So these are conducted in everyday or real life environments. So this is the big difference between field experiments and laboratory experiments. Because of the fact that a field experiment is conducted in an everyday environment, it tends to lead to a lower level of control than within a laboratory experiment, meaning that there is more possibility of extraneous variables affecting the results. So there is still manipulation of the independent variable within a field experiment. That's important to be aware of. People tend to slip up there and think that a field experiment, there is no manipulation of the independent variable. That is not the case. Due again to this low level of control within a field experiment, we have a disadvantage of the fact that a field experiment is hard to replicate. So thinking back to the idea of a standardized procedure within a laboratory experiment, that standardized procedure feeds in to the level of replication. Now, high levels of control, the ability to replicate research, all feeds into the debate of psychology as a science, and that's fairly important to be aware of. Okay, so we've recapped on what the different types of experiment are. We've recapped on the different types of experimental design and looked at the advantages and disadvantages of each independently. Now, so moving forward, you need to be aware on how you might be examined on the content that's been covered. So you could get within section A of component 1, paper 1, you could get it cropping up with multiple choice questions. So I'm not going to go through each of these, but just so that you've got a bit of a flavour for the kind of question that you could be asked in a multiple choice question. Please be aware that you could also be asked a research methods related question to do with a course study. So in paper 1, looking at the point there, the question there of this was done in this study, why was this done? So for example, you could be asked, Bandora pre-tested the participants to assess aggression levels, why was this done? And the answer would be that it allowed for a matched pairs design. So you'd be given multiple choice options on that, and matched pairs design would be one of them. Okay. The question above that one is also important to be aware of. So you could be asked, how was the DV measured or the IV manipulated in, say, Piliovin's study? So it's not just going to be multiple choice questions. Within the section B of component 1, paper 1, you could also be asked to draw upon your knowledge of experiments and experimental design in the research, design and response section. So you could be asked to compare experiments or experimental designs with other methods or other experimental designs. So for example, outline one strength of an independent measures design in comparison to a repeated measures design, or outline one weakness of a field experiment in comparison to a laboratory experiment. You could be asked questions that relate to ethical issues that surround a certain type of experiment or experimental design. So within a field experiment, if there's the element of deception, then you might be asked a question that it looks for you to draw upon that knowledge. The final point, you could be asked to design an experiment within the 15 mark question. Now this question within section B, the 15 marker, will be the bulk of this section and will be the bulk of where you're having to actually design research yourself. So you'll be given a scenario from which to base the research on. You'll be told this is the method that you're using, and then you'll be given 4 bullet points on the paper that are what you need to be hitting, so to speak, throughout your answer in order to access the top mark band. Okay, so you have to hit each one of those 4 bullet points. Now this does not mean that you have to do it within that order. However, it may be the case that you do it in that order, and that's not a problem at all, as long as throughout your answer you refer to those 4 bullet points. Then you're straight away giving yourself the opportunity to access the top mark band. Now, just because you've hit all 4 of those bullet points does not mean that you will automatically end up in the top mark band. You also need to be able to A, justify your decisions within this 15 mark question. So there's no point in just saying I would use an independent measures design within this piece of research. You need to go further and say I would use an independent measures design within this research because X, Y, Z. And again, Just because you've hit all 4 points, just because you've justified your decisions, doesn't mean, again, that you're definitely going to end up in the top mark band. In order to ensure that you have every possible opportunity available to end up in that top mark band, you also need to make sure that you are continuously contextualizing your answer. This is key throughout pretty much any sort of question related to research design. And what I mean by contextualizing is you need to make sure that you don't just say, I would use an independent measures design because of X, Y, Z. You need to say, I would use an independent measures design within this research and refer to the research that's been given to you because of X, Y, Z, and relate it back to the research again. So continuously making reference to that, you know that it suits the topic that you've been given by the exam board. So finally, in section C of component 1 paper 1, you may also be examined in this section on experimental design or experiments. And that final point that I've put there relates to what I referred to earlier when we were looking at experimental design and non-parametric tests. This is the kind of question that you could be asked. So, the psychologist has analysed their data using chi-squared. Give 2 reasons for this choice with reference to the study. So within that type of question again, you'd be saying, well, this is the experimental design that was used, and this experimental design is applicable to chi-squared. Another reason could be, well, this is the level of data that was collected by the psychologist, and this is applicable to chi-squared. But you would also need to ensure that within your answer, again, you contextualize to the study that you've been given. So showing how this was the experimental design that was used, showing how this was the level of data that was collected, again, making sure it's contextualized to the study. So here's an example of how this would be the case. So this is the kind of scenario that you could be given in terms of research. And to reiterate, context is going to be key within the answer. The element of context is what's going to separate those individuals who know their psychological knowledge and know it inside out, but don't think to apply it to the research that's been given, and those that do. And this is the mark scheme that goes along with one of the questions that accompanies this study, just so you can see how you could refer to the context. So the words that are here, so supermarket, shopping, memory, colour of words, green, these are all key words that you could use within your answer to ensure that you got full marks for this question. So it wouldn't be enough to just say, even though the question says describe one strength and one weakness of the sampling technique, if you just said one strength of the sampling technique, one weakness of the sampling technique, you could only get 2 marks here. Whereas if you say one strength and one weakness in relation to the study, so using these contextual words or anything similar related to this scenario, this is where you pick up your 2 extra marks. So your AO2 marks, your application marks. Okay. Now, if you'd like to look at this question or give it a go, then you can see here that it's taken from the Component 1 Practice Papers 2016, which are available through the interchange section of the OCR website. And that brings us to the end of this revision session. So if you've got any further questions, as I've said before, you can email me and my address is just down there for you. You can tweet me, or you can ask me through the Tumblr. Now, this is a really good feature of Tumblr, the fact that you can ask questions on there and it can be anonymous. So if you're thinking, I've got this question, but I don't want anyone to know that it's me that's asking, you can do that on there. And I won't know that it's you, and nobody else will know that it's you when the answer gets published to the blog. Okay? I hope that's been helpful, and thank you very much.